Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Bible class this morning. It's going to be a beautiful day. Hope you can get outside and enjoy that a little bit. We're in John chapter 4. We're going to get the very end of John chapter 4 and begin into John chapter 5 for our Bible class this morning. But again, as we study the book of John, we can't not look at the book of John without remembering the golden thread, again, that runs through John's gospel. It's revealed to us in John chapter 20 that St. John pulls us out after the resurrection and says, now Jesus did many other signs and miracles in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. John says, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Okay, so believing in Jesus. John writes all that he writes so that we believe in Jesus, and that by believing in Jesus, we will have life in his name. Okay, so let's look at, find those threads then in our accounts for today. And again, in our Bible class, obviously you can't ask me questions or we can't interact, but I don't want you just to watch me. I want you to follow along in the scriptures and be reading them with me. So we're in John chapter 4. I'm going to read verses 46 to the end of chapter 4, okay, because that's one section, and I'll talk about that. And then we'll come back and start chapter 5. So John chapter 4, beginning at verse 46. So Jesus came again to Cana in Galilee, where he had made the water wine. And at Capernaum there was an official whose son was ill. When this man heard that Jesus had come from Judea to Galilee, he went to him and asked him to come down and heal his son, for he was at the point of death. So Jesus said to him, unless you see signs and wonders, you will not believe. The official said to him, Sir, come down before my child dies. Jesus said to him, Go, your son will live. The man believed the word that Jesus spoke to him and went on his way. As he was going down, his servants met him and told him that his son was recovering. So he asked them the hour when he began to get better, and they said to him, Yesterday, at the 7th hour, the fever left him. The father knew that was the hour when Jesus had said to him, Your son will live. And he himself believed, and all his household. This was now the second sign that Jesus did when he had come to Judea, from Judea to Galilee. All right, so there's the first section of scriptures we'll talk about this morning. But before we get into it, notice where Jesus is at, where he had been and where he is going. So last Sunday we talked about the Samaritan woman at the well. So Jesus, this goes all the way back to chapter 3, when Jesus and his disciples are pitted against John the Baptist and his disciples by the Jews, wanting them to experience some rivalry. And of course Jesus wasn't going to have that, so Jesus left Cana in Galilee, and then he went into Samaria. And that's where we find him talking to the woman at the well. That's what we talked about last week. And so after, his encounter with the woman at the well, again, she comes to believe the golden thread. Now he's going back. Okay? So we're back. And we're back to where Jesus was at when he turned the water into wine. Now, what you need to remember about this is that if something like that were to happen, say, in our town here today, that this interesting character was at a party and turned water into wine, and not only that, but the best wine, and not only just a little bit, but 120 gallons of it. That word is going to get around. People are going to talk about that for a while. Okay? And people are going to remember it. Now that's important when we consider Jesus healing the official's son. Okay? Because the official's son, at the beginning of John chapter 4, does not believe. He does not believe Jesus. We kind of can see this in what Jesus says. Jesus, the man comes to Jesus almost out of desperation. So seemingly, the doctors couldn't do anything for his son. Maybe his prayers could not have necessarily have not done anything for his son. And then he remembers what this guy did at a wedding feast, several days ago. He remembers. And he hears that, that guy is back in town. Okay? So out of desperation, that guy turned water into wine. Well, why can't that guy heal my son? Okay? Now we know that this is kind of out of desperation. Because Jesus, knowing all things, notice what the first thing he says. This is verse 48. Well, I will read verse 47 first. So when this man heard that Jesus had come from Judea to Galilee, he went to him and asked him to come down and heal his son. Okay? So there's the request. There's the moment of desperation. Okay? There's nothing else has helped his son, so he's going to go to this guy who turned water into wine, and maybe he can do something. Which leads us then to verse 48. And Jesus, knowing all things, reveals what is at the heart of this man's desire, his question. So Jesus said to him, unless you see signs and wonders, you will not believe. Okay? But here's the interesting thing. Jesus is going to use a sign and a wonder to have this man and his household believe. Okay? So Jesus knows that the guy is remembering the turning the water into wine. That's the first sign that Jesus did in Cana in Galilee. And you remember the whole purpose of the first sign Jesus did in Cana in Galilee when he turned the water into the wine? It's so that his disciples would believe in him. All right? So again, our golden thread all over. This time, though, it's an official. Oh, a few notes about the official. Who's the official, right? We have two options, biblical scholarship leans on one. So he's an official. That's all we say. That's all we see. That's verse 46. And at Capernaum there was an official whose son was ill. Now, the actual original word used there has the feeling that it's like a servant of the king. Is kind of how that word originally it presents to us. Okay, so a servant of the king. Now, the king in first century Judea, first century of the Middle East, we have two options for the king. The first is Caesar. Okay, so then this guy, could be an official of Caesar. Okay, the second though could be Herod, King Herod, who was the Jewish ruler, kind of the Jewish stooge, kind of the fake king placed in rule and authority over the area, and most likely that is who this guy is serving, is King Herod. Okay, so that's what it means to be the official, right? Servant of the king. That's simply what it is. Okay, so again, verse 48. So Jesus said to him, "Unless you see signs and wonders, you will not believe." The official said to him, "Sir, come down before my child dies." All right, we see even more desperation there. Because if you were the official, what would you expect? So you come with this request of Jesus, we heard that he turned water into wine. Maybe he wasn't there to see it. Because really all Jesus, Jesus didn't say any magic words to turn water into wine. Jesus didn't have a magic wand that he waved over the water to turn it into wine. Jesus didn't have a big cauldron boiling with eyes of newt and frog's feet or whatever, and that turned the water into wine. No, Jesus just did it, spoke the word, perhaps. Okay? But the official doesn't know that. So again, he asks Jesus to come and heal his son. He doesn't get the answer from Jesus that he, expects. Again, remember, is the answer from Jesus, "Unless you see the signs and wonders, you will not believe." Well, that's not helpful, is it? And so, even more desperate, he says, "Sir, come down before the child dies." Because he thinks that Jesus, in order to do signs and wonders, needs to maybe go lay his hands on his son, or pull out his magic wand and wave it over his son, or maybe give his son some miraculous medicine or something. But that's not what Jesus does. Again, remember, he says, "Unless you see signs and wonders." And you notice, the official doesn't get to see, does he? No. Verse 50. Jesus said to him, "Go, your son will live." And that is when we have, and this is verse 50, our golden thread. For some reason, we don't know why, it clicks. And it says, after Jesus says, "Go, your son will live," it says, in the middle of verse 50, "The man believed the word that Jesus spoke to him and went on his way." Okay? So seemingly, the man the man's son was somewhere else, a journey away. And again, remember what Jesus said, "Unless you see signs and miracles," and yet the man does not get to see. All the man has is the words of Jesus. He has to believe the words of Jesus. Okay? Because it is the words of Jesus that heals his son. It's not any great act of pageantry or big showy incantations or anything like that. No, it's simply the word of Jesus. And the man believes. And he doesn't get to see the miraculous sign of the healing of his son. Okay? Remember the purpose that John wrote his gospel. These things are written so that you, right? You who have not seen Jesus. Well, that reminds us of Thomas, right? And actually, John chapter 20, the purpose of the book comes right after doubting Thomas. Jesus says, "You believe because you have seen me. Blessed are those who believe and have not seen." Because you see, that is all of us. We don't get to see Jesus turn water into wine. We don't get to see Jesus miraculously heal people. We don't get to see Jesus raise people from the dead, as we'll hear in our gospel lesson later on in our church service. We don't get to see it, and so Jesus says, "Blessed are you who believe and do not see." And again, John pulls us out of that and says, "These things are written," right? Notice, written, to be heard, so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. That's what happens with the official. Okay? He came to Jesus expecting to see signs and miracles. Jesus spoke his word, and he believed it. And it was done. And so that's why we end here with the official going to his home, seeing his son is healed, talking to his servants, inquiring them, well, when was it exactly that my son was healed? And it was the 7th hour. Again, last week we talked about, kind of how people tell time, that they start their clock at about 6 o'clock in the morning when sun rises. So the 7th hour, assumedly, would be about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Okay? And so the servant said, well, it was the 7th hour. The man knew at the 7th hour is when Jesus said to me, your son will live. And the result, you remember our golden thread. Of course you're going to remember our golden thread, because I only say it every 5 minutes. The man, this is end of verse 53. The man, and he himself believed, and all his household. So I can't help but mention who is in a household. Well, maybe so the man and his wife, maybe her parents or his parents, their children, right? So when we get into the book of Acts, and it says households were believed and baptized, who believed and was baptized? All of them. Grandma, grandpa, mom and dad, and the children. So here too we have Jesus bringing someone to faith, simply though by his word, but then attached to that is a miraculous sign. Now often, a quick note about some parallel examples in the Gospels. All right? So the official that we just read about, whose son is in need of healing, is often compared and contrasted to things like in you don't have to turn there. I'll just mention it. Things like in Matthew chapter 8. Matthew chapter 8, there is a centurion. Okay, now a centurion certainly is a Roman official, and the centurion has a servant who is in need of healing. So the centurion goes to Jesus and says, "Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home, suffering terribly." And Jesus said to him, "I will come and heal him." But the centurion replied, "Lord, I am not worthy to have you come under my roof, but only say the word and my servant will be healed." Okay? And Jesus does that, right? He doesn't go to the centurion's home. But you see, that's on the centurion, okay? Now often, what we just read from John's Gospel, the official, the servant of the king, is compared and contrasted to the faith of the centurion here in Matthew chapter 8. Another example would be Luke chapter 7. In Luke chapter 7, we also have an account of Jesus healing the centurion's servant. As the scriptures were written, as God the Holy Spirit worked through the men who wrote the account of the Lord Jesus, we know through biblical scholarship that St. John's Gospel was most likely the last one to be written, and that St. John probably had known about St. Matthew's Gospel or Mark's Gospel. But what we can see clearly, especially as we go through John's Gospel, is what John did not do. John did not just simply take Matthew's Gospel and copy it, kind of go paragraph by paragraph and then add in his 2 cents. No, that's not what he did. Okay? St. John records for us what he was eyewitness to. So perhaps he was not there at the healing of the centurion, but he was there for the healing of the official's son. So it's important to note that for faithful Christianity, we see these two things as separate events, that they're not the same, that they both happened at different times. And John happens to record what he has seen. And why does he record it? The golden thread, because I don't think I mentioned it in the last 5 minutes, that these things are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So we go on to chapter 5. At chapter 5, we have a slight shift. We have a little, the feeling shifts ever so slightly. Because up in the first 4 chapters of John's Gospel, Jesus was still kind of, he was novel. He was new. The things he was doing were kind of out of the ordinary, and people didn't quite know how to take it, right? And that's why, well, for example, that's why you have Nicodemus. Remember in John chapter 3, Nicodemus going to Jesus at night, okay, under the cover of darkness so no one will see him, to figure out who Jesus is because he's not sure. And then in chapter 3, you have the Jews still not sure what's going on with this Jesus of Nazareth who's doing these miraculous things. So they try to pit John the Baptist and Jesus against one another. Okay? Well, in chapter 5, we have the shift that now, as Jesus is saying and teaching and doing more things, we're going to have now not just kind of misunderstanding, not simply, we're not sure who this guy is, but now from the religious leaders, we're going to have direct opposition. We're going to have a flat-out conflict as they begin to see that maybe Jesus is the Son of God. All right? And that if they believe, which they can't believe, but if they believe they have life in his name, well, if you can't believe, then the opposite is true. So we begin in John chapter 5 to see this conflict begin head on. And we ultimately know where this conflict goes. It goes to Palm Sunday. It goes to Maundy Thursday, Gethsemane. Those religious leaders who do not believe arrest, and ultimately Good Friday to kill Jesus. Even up into after Easter and as the beginning of the church, where still the Jews persecute the followers of the way. They persecute the believers of Jesus. Okay? And we find the beginnings of this here in John chapter 5. So what I'm going to read for you, and if you'll follow along, is the first 17 verses of John chapter 5. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now, there is in Jerusalem, by the sheep's gate, a pool, in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has 5 roofed colonnades. In these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be healed?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. And while I am going, another steps down before me." Jesus said to him, "Get up, take your bed, and walk." And at once the man was healed, and he took up his bed and walked. Now, that day was the Sabbath. So the Jews said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath, and it is not lawful for you to take up your bed." But he answered them, "The man who healed me, that man said to me, 'Take up your bed and walk.'" They asked him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Take up your bed and walk'?" Now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, as there was a crowd in the place. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you." The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had healed him. And this was why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, "My Father is working until now, and I am working." I'm going to read the next verse also. This was why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. All right, so there we have another miracle done by Jesus. And the reaction here at this one, though, is not that people believed. Notice it never once said that the man who was healed believed, right? So our golden thread is actually hidden here. Okay? It's there, right? Because we can see the confession of faith the healed man gives to the Jews, the Jewish leaders, but it never said that actual word believed. Okay, so the purpose that we have St. John recording this miracle of Jesus is to begin to show the opposition that Jesus is going to have against the Jews, against the religious leaders. So I'll briefly talk about some of the background things here. First of all, notice how John marks time. This is in verse 1 of chapter 5. After this, there was a feast of the Jews. Okay, so not only is it a Sabbath, but it is also a special time. And Jesus goes to this place by the sheep's gate. It's a pool, and in Aramaic it's called Bethesda. Now, what's interesting is, how do we use that name, Bethesda? Well, we apply it to hospitals. There's a lot of hospitals named Bethesda. When I was a pastor up in South Dakota, one of the larger nursing homes there was called Bethesda. Okay, so this name Bethesda has come into association of a place of healing, of rest, of where the weak are taken care of. But notice, though, that the man who is an invalid for 38 years has not been taken care of very well here, because it says he's laid there it says he's been invalid for 38 years. It just says he's been there a long time, hopefully not all 38 years laying there. But notice Jesus' question then. Jesus says to him, "Do you want to be healed?" Now, what kind of question is that? Okay? Now imagine if you were sick, if you had an ailment, if you were paralyzed or whatever, someone comes up to you and says, "Do you want to be healed?" Well, yeah, of course I want to be healed. What are you even asking me that for? But the man that is in need of healing, he's a little more polite than that. So he puts the best construction on it. And he thinks, well, Jesus is going to help me into the pools. Okay? Now, I won't get into too much about the whole thought process of stirring up the sediment and the minerals and all that the sludge at the bottom of the pool to put these people in. But that kind of is the idea. So the man thinks Jesus wants to help him do that. And again, remember, he's not been taken care of very well. Why do we know that? It says, this is verse 7. After Jesus asked him, do you want to be healed? Of course he wants to be healed, Jesus. What are you asking that for? But he says, sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. And while I am going, another steps down before me. Kind of like, on Black Friday when everyone's trying to get that TV and pushing each other over. That seems to be what the man is talking about, right? He's trying to make his way in there and someone barges their way in first. And so he assumes then, well, Jesus is, or this guy, he doesn't know Jesus' name yet. This guy is going to help me in there. This guy will protect me from the other people that try to get in my way. Okay? So when Jesus asks him, do you want to be healed? That's what the man's thinking of. But notice what Jesus does. And again, this is the Sabbath. Okay? This is verse 8. Jesus said to him, get up, take your bed, and walk. And at once the man was healed, and he took up his bed and walked. Now, the problem here is that, well, it's not a problem for us. It's not a problem for Jesus. It's a problem that the Jewish religious leaders have, is that Jesus broke the Sabbath. Right? Now, in the Jewish religion, so if you read the book of, if you read the first 5 books of the Bible, obviously we have the third commandment. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. Okay, and then more than that, it goes on to, as God is explaining it to Moses, that God created the world in 6 days, and so on the 7th day God rested. So too should God's people work for 6 days, and then on the 7th day shall be a day of rest, where no work should be done. Well then, so that command, the Jewish people took it and tried to define it so clearly, so minutely, that they missed the forest because of the trees. Okay, so I'll give you an example. So in the book of it's Leviticus, Numbers, or Deuteronomy, I don't remember which. When Moses is teaching about the Sabbath day, one of the commands is, you shall not even start a fire. Okay? Because a little story is told, again, Leviticus, Numbers, or Deuteronomy, I don't remember which. A little story is told of a person who on the Sabbath went out and gathered sticks and lit a fire. Well, they were punished by death. Okay, so you can't even light a fire. Now, so a story one of my seminary professors told, when he was living in St. Louis, going through the seminary. St. Louis has a large Jewish population, and his job, this seminary professor's job, was on the Sabbath day. He worked at kind of a big apartment building, a retirement apartment building in a Jewish community, so it was all Jewish people that lived in there. And his one job was to go there on the Sabbath day and stand in the elevator and push the buttons for the people. Because in the Jewish religion, even pushing the button on the elevator, which caused a light to light up, that was like making fire, and so that was breaking the Sabbath. And so and he even said his title was the apartment Gentile boy. That was his job, is to push the elevator buttons so that they would not break the Sabbath by doing that. So that's the background of what's going on here. So if you can't even push an elevator button on the Sabbath according to the Jewish religion, what do you think about healing someone? Or what the Pharisees get up in arms about? What about carrying or taking up your bed? You know, the guy had to fold up all of his stuff and carry it away. That was work. That was breaking the Sabbath. And they wanted to know why was he was doing it. They didn't care that, wow, he was an invalid 2 minutes ago, and now he's up walking around. No, all they care about, why, you're doing work, right? And so, this is verse 12. They ask him, well, who is the man who said to you, take up your bed and walk? Because they wanted to know who it is that thought that they knew better than the law of Moses. Who was it that thought that they had more authority to say to someone, well, you can do work on the Sabbath, when Moses and the law of God was clear that you could not? Who is this God? Because we need to set him right? We need to squash this now. We can't have someone thinking that they're above the law of Moses. So they want to know who he is. And the man didn't know, okay, until Jesus went out and found him. He found him out in the courtyard and Jesus says, see, you're well, right? Because that's the big important part. That's what we should all care about, is that Jesus healed a guy of his disability. And that's a wonderful thing, because that shows that in Jesus, the kingdom of God has come among humanity. And what Jesus does is what God is all about. So even the healing of the disabled man, that shows that that's the kind of God we have. A God that wants to heal us of our ills. A God that wants to restore us. All right? And that should be the most important thing. But again, the Jewish religious leaders turns it into Exhibit A in the evidence against Jesus. And to wrap it up here, we'll have to wrap it up. Verse 17. So seemingly the Jews were there around Jesus. Verse 17. Jesus answered them, my Father is working until now, and I am working. So here Jesus claims God as his Father. And he claims it directly to the religious leaders, the Jews. And that's why we have verse 18. This was why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him. Because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. So that will wrap it up for today. So for next week, we'll take the rest of chapter 5. We might begin chapter 6 as Jesus, we'll keep it at that, as Jesus talks about where his authority comes from. So again, remember always though, the golden thread, these things are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name.